everybody. This is Tim Reister, Chief Strategy Officer at Corporate Visions, and I'm joined by Dr. Carmen Simon, Chief Science Officer at Corporate Visions. We're excited to be bringing you this webcast today. The demand and the response from you all has been overwhelming, to say the least. So we practically broke the webcasting platform yesterday, so we are recording this rendition for everyone who couldn't get in, and those of you who were there and want to share it with others that you feel would see this as important. So it's my pleasure now to introduce you to Dr. Carmen Simon. She's going to take us part of the way. I'll rejoin you a little bit later, but welcome to delivering memorable virtual presentations. Carmen, over to you.
Thank you, Tim, and welcome everyone. The key phrase in this presentation is the word memorable, because as you are presenting to your customers virtually, the best virtual presentation is one that your customers remember and can act on. Easier said than done, because I'm sure, as you know, memory is fallible. From our research, we are noticing that regardless of how brilliant a presentation is, and especially when it's done virtually, people tend to forget a lot after 48 hours, as much as 90% and sometimes even more. And who's to blame our audiences, really? Your customers live in a world where there is no shortage of content. Very soon, there will not be any shortage of virtual pitches that they get to attend. There's a lot going on. So of course, forgetfulness is about to happen. But while we can't really change the reality of today's world, we're posing another question from a scientific and very practical angle. What if you could at least control the small percentage that customers do tend to take away and retain long term? What if you were to be disciplined about being in charge of that 10% message? I'm looking at that 10% message as a metaphorical number, because where business content is concerned, it's almost impossible to place a strict statistic as to how much people take away. Sometimes they might remember 18%, sometimes they might remember 2%. It is possible that they remember nothing. But we know that if you do a good job, and the purpose of this session is to enable you to do a good job, they will take something away. And the question is, are you in charge of that metaphorical 10% that you put in their minds? And take it a step further, because what is memory used for if not to make decisions? And if you can link that 10% message to something that you and your audiences find desirable, then you're increasing your chances of being persuasive, even when you're presenting to your customers remotely. So for the rest of the session, let's look at exactly that. How can you be in charge of that 10% message that customers take away, even when they attend your sessions remotely? Well, if you want to control anything, the very first step is to clarify what you want to be memorable for. If we're promising a memorable virtual session, the very first step to take is to clarify your 10%. A lot of sellers that we're working with aspire at becoming memorable, but not that many know what they want to be memorable for. As you're looking at your presentations, and quite often in a virtual space, they will take more of the real estate in the virtual environment that you're inviting your customers in. Step back and ask the question, what is really the most important message that I want them to remember? If I had the courage to call them in 48 hours from now, what would I want them to tell me that is still on their minds? Regardless of how long or how short your presentations is, there must be one message, and one message only, that stands out from the rest. Do you know what that message is for you? It's all in your hands. And when you start with this very humbling question, what do I want my customers to remember? You're already on your journey of becoming memorable. Often, though, people believe that if they have a well-organized agenda, very much like you're seeing here on the screen, then surely that is a solid 10% message. And that's not quite so. Whenever you see an agenda, whether somebody has given it to you or whether you're creating it yourself, use it as an opportunity to ask, what is my 10% message? Because even as you're looking at this list of topics, do you see how what we're still missing is one message that unifies all of these other subsets? So from here on out, as you're wondering, how can I create a memorable virtual presentation for my customers, use the agenda word as a cue to ask, what is a 10% message and what ties all of my messages together? You can replace the word agenda with the 10% message, and you can do it in a very fancy way, very much like you can see here an example that has been designed by our team. But it doesn't always have to be also fancy. Even something as simple as what you see here on my screen in terms of one main message supported by 3 points is going to get the job done for you. The same in here. Notice the simplicity of this message and the 3 supporting points. This is very specific, obviously, to the team that has created this example. And the point that I want you to take away is that you don't necessarily have to have the most amazing design skills in order to earn a spot in somebody else's mind. It starts with the clarity of what you want to put in other people's brains. And obviously, you can add some design elements to the presentation in itself and to the 10% message and the way that it is created. Clarify the 10% message and notice how I come back to this notion of no more than 3 or 4 supporting points. And why is that? It's not that the brain is not capable of remembering more. Sure, we can remember many things, but as time lapses from your presentation and to the point where customers have to make decisions in your favor, that time lapse is not the only culprit that leads to memory decay. Time lapse is combined with the volume that you add and present to your customers. Imagine that you are part of this experiment for a moment. I would show you a series of squares, very much like you see here on the screen. And then in the next screen, I would show you a color wheel and ask you, where on that color wheel do these squares belong? And it's easy to complete the assignment when you only have one square. For instance, as you're looking at this one here on the screen, if you saw the color wheel next, it's probably fairly easy for you to identify where that green square belongs. Now notice how the exercise becomes a little bit harder the moment that I increase the volume of elements that I'm inviting you to look at. For instance, as you're looking at these squares, it's probably still fairly easy for you to identify the location. And if you're thinking about these 2 spots, you're correct. But notice how I can amplify the stimulus in terms of volume yet. And as I give you more, and you're looking at these squares, if I take them away and I ask you to remember, now the exercise becomes a little bit harder. But perhaps you're still in the game looking at where those squares belong. But now notice if I take it a step further, and I may not even give you that much time to reflect on where these elements belong. The moment that I take them away and I bring this back, now the exercise becomes a lot more difficult. And you can take it even a step further yet. And by now, you're probably sensing the frustration that happens to your brain because there's no way that you could accurately find the corresponding areas from the squares to this color wheel once they're no longer in your vision. But if you tried, here's the correct answer. And the practical guideline to extract from this, as you reflect on your virtual presentations for your customers, is this: be very humbled by the fact that as time decays and as you're adding more and more elements to your presentations, the precision of memory decays as well. So as you're reflecting on how many elements to include in your next virtual pitch for your customers, know that 3 or 4 supporting points are sufficient for you to be in charge of a more precise memory that you put in other people's brains. If you're looking at this example of a 10% message, notice that design-wise, it's very simple. This is something that you could probably do on your own very easily. But as people were presenting to their own customers in terms of their leadership framework, notice how there are only 3 elements that they want them to take away long-term. The same in here. Obviously, this example amps the design element, and when we use our own high-end design work, we create elements like these. But design doesn't necessarily always have to be part of it. Even a simple design such as this one, or it doesn't get any more simple than this: 1 main message, 3 supporting points. In fact, the next time that you have the opportunity to reflect on your 10% message, do have the courage to start from scratch, because when you're facing the blank slide and now it's only you with 1 main message and some supporting points, the clarity can become even better for you. So the very first step on your journey to earning a spot in your customers' brains as you're presenting virtually is to clarify what you want to be memorable for. Clarify your 10% and add to those no more than 3 or 4 supporting points. Notice how very subtly, even in the design of our 10% slide here, I'm showing subtly that there is some repetition here, because once you have clarified your 10% message, make sure that you return to that at least a few times throughout the span of your virtual presentation, because there is no secret. Repetition is the mother of memory. And the more you return to that same message again and again and again, the more you can sharpen the precision of a memory that you put in your audience's minds. Speaking of sharpening things, as you have clarified your 10% message and your 3 or 4 supporting points, next, in a virtual environment, you have got to be aware of how many distractions and how much multitasking can happen on your customer side. There is just no way around it. We have to be very cautious, because these days you're probably competing with the TV, you're competing with the fridge, you're competing with the bed. There are so many more rewarding things in somebody's environment, especially as many of your customers may be working from home. Do you know where audiences are looking, where your information is concerned? And in order for the answer to be yes, the next principle that I want to cover in today's session is your ability to control where your customers are looking. And the reason why this is important is because attention is a function of focus. And since the promise of today's session is to enable you to become memorable to your customers, it's a lot harder to create memories in other people's brains unless you attract their attention first. And in a virtual environment, attention does not come easily. Do you know where your audiences are looking as you're presenting? There are some very easy and practical ways in which you can control where people are looking. Take color, for instance. As I have just switched the screen here, I know exactly where you're looking, even though the screen is not very complex. This is something that you can do on your own. But notice how through the simple use of color, at the expense of everything else, you can indeed prompt people to look where you want them to look. Obviously, you can amp the design quality, and we do that when we use our own design department. In here, I know exactly where you're looking simply because the color is so intense right here in the middle of the screen. But you don't necessarily have to have graphic arts skills in order to control where people are looking. Imagine that you're presenting to your customers something as complex as this. I'm sure many of you listening to this have to display to your customers a lot of very complex and quite often highly technical data. And in here, the mistake that a virtual seller would make is that there are too many elements competing for our attention all at once. Notice, however, how with the use of color and with the use of graying things out, I now have directed your attention only to one part of the screen. I can explain that first, and then I can add color to another part of the screen, and I can explain that next. It takes all of 20 seconds in PowerPoint to add color to some elements and gray out some other elements. And with that very small time investment on your part, you're getting an outstanding ROA, which is a return on attention. So use of color is one very easy to implement technique in order for you to know where your customers are looking. It's the same for size, and sometimes size goes in combination with color. Right here, as I switch the screen, I know exactly where your eyes are going simply because some elements are larger than other elements. How can you apply that into your next virtual presentation? Well, take a look at this screen. This is not the most amazing slide you have ever seen, but however, when the virtual presenter wants us to pay attention to a specific area on the screen, notice how when that area becomes enlarged, you cannot escape it. Now I am prompted to look at this segment. It is very easy for you to apply. Same in here, this presenter was talking about the big data analytics opportunity. And obviously there are quite a few elements going on the screen. This is probably a very realistic example for all of you. But the point that he really wanted to make was that at the intersection of these circles is where you can unlock some business value for your customers. And if I really want you to pay attention to that element, notice how when I enlarge it, I am prompting you to look. this is something that you can definitely apply for your next virtual session for your customers. And in addition to color and size, of course, you can use animation. Notice how here, this is not a very fancy slide, but as I'm about to present something that is fairly complex, I know where you're looking next, and I know where your eyes are guided next, and I know where you're prompted to look next, simply through the use of animation and building things gradually. You don't have to get very sophisticated in terms of animation types, especially if you're using a program like PowerPoint. A simple effect such as appear, disappear, fade in, and fade out will enable you to prompt where your customers are looking next. And we are very cautious when it comes to animation because one of the differentiating factors from face-to-face selling situations to now remote selling situations is the ability to add and the necessity to add more animation. And why is that? As we are doing our neuroscience research, and often we use eye tracking devices on screens that do not have a lot of animation, such as the example that you see here, we're noticing that there are a few hot spots that get generated, as indicated here by the brighter areas. But then the rest, can you see how scattered the attention is and how you're making the brain either work a little harder trying to make sense of things that do not move, or you're essentially inviting mind wandering. And this is what happens in screens like this. Whereas when you extract some elements out and you're adding more animation and more slides in your presentation, much like we're doing here as an after example, do you see how you have fewer of these hotspots, but they're more targeted and there is less wasted energy for the brain to figure out what the rest of the screen means. So for your next virtual session for your customers, consider adding extra animation and more slides versus fewer slides and less animation, because you'll make it easy for the brain to stay with you for a longer period of time. And speaking of enabling the brain to stay with you, you can also control focus very much like I'm doing right now. I know where you're looking and I know where you're looking next. And the way that I can control this easily is because I don't have a whole lot going on this screen. There are very few elements. And you can apply this technique as well, reducing sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes the amount of information that you're sharing with your customers. For example, this is a slide from somebody's technical presentation. And even though this is technical and fairly complex at the same time, it's easy for the brain to look at it because there isn't a whole lot going on the screen. So consider reducing the quantity of information that you sometimes offer in order to control where people are looking. So if we were to summarize this session on controlling focus, there are 4 highly practical techniques you can apply as early as this afternoon. Consider reducing sometimes the amount of elements that you're displaying at one time on the screen. Consider using size, and when something should attract the customer's attention, just simply make it bigger. Consider using the color, and there is no such thing. We can talk about the psychology of color. Are some colors better than other colors? Don't be too concerned about that. Be concerned with using colors so that you can attract attention to one element at the expense of something else. So graying things out is a very easy to implement skill, and it will give you that ROA, that return on attention. And of course, the build animations must become your friend from here on out when you are in remote selling situations, because when you build things gradually, you are taking away the brain's ability to predict what happens next, so people will stay with you for a longer amount of time. And in this miniature section on controlling your focus, as you're looking at these 4 practical techniques, I would like to turn it back over to Tim, because he has a few extra ones that we can add to this very practical repository that enables you to control your customer's attention. Tim, back to you.
All right, thanks, Carmen. So for a brief moment, you see Carmen and I enlarged on the screen. I think this is a technique too, Carmen, when you say that maybe in the middle of a long presentation where you're just a postage stamp, you briefly turn it off and we come back on full screen and we can build rapport and we can be engaging and we can laugh. But thank you for that awesome ROA. I love that analogy, return on attention. I got a couple ideas that I want to share here that I don't know if I want to call them advanced ideas, Carmen, or what the appropriate phrasing would be. But in addition to animation and all the other things, I want to talk a little bit about annotation. There are techniques now, whether you're using iPads or your laptops, have the opportunity to annotate using a simple stylus and being able to engage people in a way where they feel like this is spontaneous, it is being built just for them. And one of the reasons I highlighted what I did is the idea here is that in a survey of sellers like you, we found out that 71% of you don't feel this environment that you're experiencing right now can be as effective as face-to-face. But I think the truth of the matter is more and more sales calls are going this direction. And for the time being, when you're probably watching this, most, if not all sales calls are in the remote direction. So we have to get over the mindset that this is not as good and start thinking about how can you make it better? How can you make it as good? And so the question becomes, why is it not as good? And what we hear people say is, if you look over here, audience interaction is non-existent. What can you do to fix that? Relationships are hard to build. What can you do to fix that? Presentations are too passive. What can you do to fix that? I want to talk about some techniques to engage your audience through annotation and note-taking right in front of their very eyes that lets them know you are part of that conversation. So what you have to know is, Carmen pointed out, this is a multitasking environment, and 87% of you in this same survey said a big part of the problem is my clients are multitasking, 87%. What was interesting in the survey is 93% of you said they would do less multitasking if their cameras were on. Well, if you want to talk about controlling the focus and getting them to stop multitasking, it appears if you turn the camera on, that might help. At least you think so. But ironically then, you said you don't turn your cameras on very often. 65% of you said you rarely, if ever, turn your cameras on, and 80% said we never ask our customers to turn their cameras on. Well, if the problem is a lack of interaction and a lack of ability to build relationships, and you know that multitasking is a problem, really, what I'm going to say is turn your camera on. It seems like a simple request, but why not be prepared to treat this like a professional selling environment? Get your camera ready, turn it on, because you yourself know they won't multitask. And I can guarantee you, whether it's through shame or through just we're all in this together, they will turn their camera on.
I can't be multitasking right now.
Right, exactly. I mean, there's too much going on here. So what I want to point out is, like, Carmen and I right now are really small and tiny little postage stamps, and the presentation is dominating the real estate that you're seeing. So you have to do something with your presentation in all the ways that Carmen just mentioned, but maybe even in an advanced way right here that you could engage, because here's an opportunity. I got a wand in my hand, a magic wand. And if the customer starts engaging now, you can start writing down the things that they're saying. You can show them that you are understanding, you are capturing. And then if they say, oh, that's not exactly it, Tim, what I really meant to say, you grab another color and you fix what they were saying here, and you can engage them in a way that accomplishes some of those things that you were talking about. So annotation in addition to animation. Now I'm going to give you one more sort of advanced move in annotation. One of the things that our research showed us is that 83% of sellers use PowerPoint in their remote presentations. Only 3.9% use any kind of annotation or whiteboard technique. If you can take this extra step, you will instantly differentiate yourself. And to help you understand that, I want you to grab a piece of paper right now. If you have one, that'd be awesome. If you can find one quickly, that'd be awesomer. Get a piece of paper and draw 3 boxes with me in ascending order. Make these boxes slightly bigger than the previous box. Now I want you in the first box to write the words listen only. What's going on here is that many times what we hear from sellers is, I don't want to introduce friction into my conversation. I don't want to ask the customer to do anything. So there's people who won't even ask them to go to a web link. You just call them on the phone and talk remotely. The people who ask them to go to a web link and see a presentation, why don't you write the words watch visuals in the second box? are getting a bigger bang, as we are talking about today, by adding a little bit of friction and getting them to get on a visual. They will remember more because of everything Carmen told you. In fact, sorry, the thing that Carmen told you that was so important is that, see, even a pro can handle a blip like that, is that there are ways to make your presentation even more memorable, even more remarkable, even more different. So adding visuals to a conversation is very important. But the big move I want to show you here with annotation is, imagine this. Why don't you add the words in the third box here, draw along. I know you were wondering, what's going in that third box? Draw along. We did an experiment where one group listened to a presentation by just listening to it. A second group listened to it and watched the PowerPoint. And then a third group listened to it, watched the PowerPoint, and was asked to draw along with the 10% message and capture that 10% message. We simply said, hey, grab a piece of paper and pen, kind of like I just asked you to do right now. And what we discovered is really impressive. And these are important numbers for you to think about if you want to be different, if you want to be memorable, and you want to be convincing. That in fact, if you write the number 14, put 14% there. People saw you as 14% different if you asked them to draw along. Meaning the people who listened and watched got a lot out of it, but those who were asked to draw along got more. They rated their experience with the story, and it was the same story. They rated their experience with the story 14% higher in terms of feeling like it was a different, unique story. They identified that they could retell the story 12% better. They said, I believe I can remember this story and retell this story. And they rated that 12% higher when they were asked to draw along, in addition to listening and watching. And perhaps even more important, they were 10% more convinced that they had a business problem that needed to be solved and that you could possibly help them just by asking them to draw along. So I'm giving you this opportunity to think about annotation on top of animation, because it turns out that no friction isn't as important as maybe adding a little friction, because what you're really adding is impact. You're creating engagement with impact that affects all of the metrics you're looking for: differentiation and uniqueness, memory, recall, retell, and being more compelling and convincing. And here's why. The screen just went blank. You need to imagine now that your presentation is over, the slides are gone, the dulcet tones of your voice have evaporated into thin air, and now they're left with a blank. And we're said it's not even a blank. Their Outlook comes up and they're looking at emails. What will they remember? I offer to you that if you look down at the piece of paper next to you right now, you could retell the story that you just heard to the next person, peer or colleague in your organization. And you might even be able to draw it out and retell that story. And now you were made smarter, your customers made smarter by the experience, and they can reshare and retell your story instead of wondering what that was all about. So your 10% is important. Controlling the focus is really important. Giving you one more step here, Carmen, maybe if you help them, ask them to document that 10% with you, they get an experience that's even more valuable. Back to you, Carmen.
Thank you so much, and I really enjoy this this notion of getting people to follow along and execute something on their own, because quite often self-generated content is one technique that earns you a spot in people's brains, and it enables you to focus on what you're doing. So give people something to do, and yet that's another technique to make sure that you know where customers are looking. When it comes to these 4 techniques and the additional ones that Tim has shared, notice how those are prompting your customers' brains to look in the external world and for you to manipulate some physical properties of the stimulation that you share, whether it's slides or the drawings that you saw. From a brain science perspective, we call those bottom-up kind of techniques to attract someone's attention. That's not the only way to attract someone's attention. You can also go top down, meaning that in addition to appealing to perception, such as the physical properties will do. You can also appeal to someone's cognition, such as their goals or knowledge they already have or expectations they come equipped with as they attend your virtual sessions. And these will ease the pressure off you as you're thinking, how am I going to design some of these things? How am I going to impact some of my slides? And the next segment is very important because you will recognize how these two go in combination. So let's look at appealing to someone's goals. Notice what happens in your own brains, even in the next 30 seconds or so, as I'm giving you a goal to find an overlapping symbol between these two pictures. There's only one image that repeats in the picture on the left and in the picture on the right. I will pause for 1 second, and this is definitely insufficient time for you to find the symbol because there's just so much going on. And I'll reveal the answer in a moment. But the point is, when someone gives you a goal, it is a lot easier for you to now stay focused on this screen versus be tempted to look somewhere else that's perhaps more exciting, such as your phone. The repeated symbol here is the beetle. And as we reflect on the importance of goals, and as you step back and you look at presentations that perhaps look like this for your next customer interaction, the question that is important to ask is, do all of these slides that you're presenting appeal to someone's existing goals? Or can you work together in a relationship with your customers to clarify some goals that they have? Because when the goal is clear, whether you have offered it or whether they have it already, attention is already guaranteed. And even though it's a cognition-based attention, at least it's granted. And this is a great thing to have in a virtual session because attention often is not necessarily received just so easily. It is earned by you, and by appealing to someone's goals, regardless if your presentations look like this, as you're seeing my screen, this is very intense. But if it maps to a goal that a customer already has, the attention will already be guaranteed. And it's the same with knowledge that your customers come equipped with as they attend your virtual sessions. You see, your audiences already have an existing set of memories or knowledge. Respect that and build your presentations off of that because their expertise will already sharpen what they see. How do we know this? I was intrigued by this experiment where scientists were analyzing 62 car accidents that happened when a driver ran over a motorcycle. Very tragic. And what they were noticing is that those car drivers had not ridden a motorcycle before, making the point that when you have experience in a specific field, then your attention is much sharper. You know what to look for. If you had ridden a motorcycle before, as now a car driver, you know to watch for those. It's the same in tennis, for instance. If you are a tennis player and you're playing at fairly high levels, the reason why pros are able to return very, very fast serves is because they know where to look at their opponent. They will look at how the trunk is positioned and how the hips are turning. And this is how they can return 130-mile-an-hour serve. Whereas for novices like you and I, we might be looking at the forearm, or maybe we look at the position of the racket. And those are not segments that can give us any kind of information. When you're an expert in a field, your focus is a lot sharper. For instance, if you're talking to software engineers and you display the screen like this doesn't necessarily need to be that simple because as an expert, you already have the ability to see an ordered set of possibilities. You already know how to chunk information. You know what to look for, whereas a novice might see just simply a blur. So this is why as you're looking at your virtual presentations, you can ease off the pressure to make everything so much more simple or extract elements, because if you're talking to experts, then they already know where to look. Knowledge sharpens focus. So ease the pressure and know that your credibility does not have to be sacrificed in a virtual session, especially when you're appealing to expert audiences. And it's the same with expectations. As your virtual customers are now joining your sessions, they come with a set of expectations. And if we were to reflect back on cars versus motorcyclists or pedestrians, these same scientists were asking the question, where would you rather be a pedestrian? In an area where car drivers already know to expect pedestrians, like in London, or in an area where car drivers hardly ever see pedestrians, like in LA? Whenever you have expectations of your reality, your focus is sharper yet. So the way that this is applicable to your virtual presentations is that as you reflect on your audiences and you know that they come to your sessions with specific expectations, know that you don't have to dumb down your content. For instance, if you're talking to highly advanced audiences and your screen looks like this, if that's what they expected to see, a certain level of detail and a certain level of intensity, and they did expect to see dense slides and charts and numbers, then meet them there, because when the brain already has some expectations, attention is already sharper. So this is what we mean here in this section on controlling focus. If you appeal to perception, which include the size, the color, the animations, the annotations that you learned from Tim, the sharing of the webcam, the reducing the amount of information sometimes, all of those are external properties of a stimulus. You can control those easily, but also take into your consideration cognition-related elements such as your audience's knowledge, your audience's goals, and your audience's expectations. And once all of this package is complete, these types of attention work off of each other, because if you prompt somebody to look somewhere with color or with size, then that attention may generate a thought. Or if somebody has a goal, then they will be more prompted to look if you have already helped them and eased that cognitive processing with some reducing the amount of information or some animation that you have added. So look at this as techniques that work in combination. And since we're talking about techniques that work in combination, here's one final practical guideline that you can apply as early as this recording is over. In your presentations, every single segment is linked to the next segment, especially as you have an array of slides. And each slide has then the potential to impact how the next slide is being processed. We call this process priming. Priming means that with one stimulus, in this case, it would be a slide, you have the ability to impact how the next slide is being perceived. So take a deck like the one that you're seeing here on the screen. It is a typical customer-facing deck where you may share a lot of data, a lot of charts, a lot of numbers, information, very useful for your customers to know. But because we know that attention is fickle and there are so many distractions and multitasking is at its prime in a virtual environment, you have to be humble enough to ask the question, by the time I reach slide 5 or slide 17 or the end of the presentation, is the brain still with me? Are people still paying attention? Because you see, attracting attention is one thing, sustaining it for a while is another. The technique that we propose to do is pick your moments that you indeed want to attract more attention to and therefore make more memorable. And right before those segments, intensify the stimulus that you show. So let's imagine that in this typical presentation, it's very important for your customers to remember something in slide 5, slide 13, and something right here at the end, or something in slide 17. Place something that's more intense right before those segments. And what happens when you deviate from a pattern, because otherwise many of your slides will be like many other slides, as we record these sessions via EEG, that's an electroencephalogram device, which we put on people's scalps, and through that we record the level of attention and engagement that your customers may have. What we notice is that with those more intense slides, you definitely get attention and engagement to those, but that attention and engagement also peaks for the next moment over, for about 30 seconds up to a minute. And I'll give you some examples of a collection that we have created that's part of the service that's called the Slide Club, which offers virtual presenters the ability to intensify the stimulus right before a slide that they want to make memorable. Those slides look something like this. You can see how intense this one gets, not only because of the design of it all, but also through the unexpected animation that follows, and obviously through its message. Here is another example. This was pertinent for a presentation in cybersecurity. And obviously there's a very slight animation there, but the powerful image and the slight surprise that you see here is what captures and heightens your attention, which you will sustain for a little bit longer. Speaking of the element of surprise, that's also present here. And once you detect that icon and you have that small eureka moment, now you're a little bit more alert and engaged for the next moment over. Here's another example from that collection, because everybody speaks about disruption these days. This slide advises to not fear disruption, but rather be a disruptor. So these are just a few examples of the more intense slides that can be placed right before some other slides that would be typical for you. The good news about priming is that as you're looking at your virtual presentations, not everything has to be at its utmost intensity in order to capture and sustain attention for a while. You can indeed be faithful to things that you have received from somebody else that follows a template that is perhaps more toned down in its design. But every so often, do have the courage to embed some of these elements, because when you do, you get extra attention and engagement to the next moment over. And surely some of these designs are a bit more sophisticated, and at some point, as you'll notice that your own audience's brains are evolving, you do have to amp the level of sophistication that you add, especially in a virtual environment as you're appealing to customers, especially as you're appealing to customers who sometimes may not be as sophisticated as you are in terms of technical knowledge or complexity. That's where the aesthetic appeal has to be higher. And also what we're noticing from a brain science perspective is that your customers' brains are evolving in terms of the stimulation that they expect. In their own time, they're expecting to see strong stimulation like you see here on the screen, but yet when they come to business environments very much like this, then this is what they get. And that gap is just way too large and the contrast is too big. So this is why as you're intensifying just a few areas in your presentation, you're appealing to perhaps sometimes less technical audiences who may not be able to match that level of complexity, and you're getting them ready to be alert and awake when you're presenting something that is a bit more complex and typical for you. As you're looking at this notion of priming, what you get out of it is this. For the next moment over, after you have primed the brain, people are finding it a lot easier to understand the information. They also understand that information a bit faster. You get extra attention and engagement. As a result, you can impact what a customer remembers. And as a result of that, you can impact how a customer decides in your favor, because there's no decision that your customers are going to make in your favor unless there is memory involved. So here we have it for priming the brain. We recommend intensifying the stimulus right before a slide that you want to make memorable. And as you look at all these three techniques, clarifying your 10%, controlling your focus, priming their brains, easy techniques that you can apply as early as you finish listening to this webcast, know that by implementing them, you are indeed earning a spot in your customers' brains. And we're looking forward to you applying these and hearing of your successes. And Tim, I'll turn it back over to you for the end of the session. Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to contribute to people's journey on becoming memorable, even when they're selling remotely.
Awesome. Thank you, Carmen. And I'm sure the audience thanks you as well. So here's the deal, folks. 71% of you said this can't be as good as face-to-face selling. Well, hopefully, through some of the techniques that both Carmen and I have shared with you today, you now see a light, a possibility to be more effective, someday maybe as effective, and maybe even someday more effectiveness than ever being face-to-face. It's possible, and here are some techniques to get you there. Now, in case you didn't capture all of that, of course, you can replay this several times and take notes, but you can also go get this toolkit. So there's an infographic here, there's an ebook there, and there's some detail on some training courses that we have to help take you and your teams even further in becoming masters of the remote selling environment. So there's the link, there's the free resources that we provide. We thank you for your time and attention. We trust it was memorable, different, and convincing. Thanks again, Carmen, and take care, everyone.